why is the Western U.S. Is that area the one that's been sort of pushing the envelope on assisted suicide? And I think it has a lot to do with there being a different culture in different areas of the U.S. And actually, the Western U.S. and Western Canada, like if you look at British Columbia and throughout that area, and you look at Oregon, California, Washington State, you almost seem to have the same culture. There are influences that I may not understand because I'm from Ontario. Don't hold that against me. And so therefore, I can't actually answer your question completely based on that. But there seems to be a big push for in the Western U.S. for being avant-garde in a way and pushing new issues. So not only did assisted suicide get legalized in Oregon first, and then Washington State second, but many years after in Washington State, it took them a long time to get their second state. The fact is now the big expansion of assisted suicide is also being promoted in the western part of the U.S. So basically, the whole issue of assisted suicide, there's 10 states and one jurisdiction that have legalized assisted suicide in the U.S. In the past 2 years, no new state has legalized assisted suicide. Now, that's a great victory, but there's been big expansions of assisted suicide in the states where it's already legal, and I'm going to go into that. And this year, there's been 20 states who have been debating legalization bills. So if you consider that there's 10 states that have legalized, it means 40 states have not. Half of those states have had bills this year where they've been debating the issue. Two states, California and Colorado, have bills to expand their assisted suicide laws. I'm going to go into that. And also two states have bills to prevent assisted suicide, meaning they haven't legalized assisted suicide in those states. And they have bills that would make it, they're like poison bills to make it nearly impossible to legalize assisted suicide in those states. Nearly every state that is legalized assisted suicide has expanded their legislation. So what's important about that point is the fact that the other side claims, and you hear them say, "Oh, well, there's no slippery slope." That's a fallacy. They'll say that we can legalize this, and this will be it. This law is designed to have safeguards. But every state pretty much that have legalized assisted suicide have also expanded it. So what's the assisted suicide lobby up to? Well, first of all, I'm going to say to you, they know they're not going to legalize assisted suicide in every state. They know it's not possible. They know there's certain states in the U.S. that will never legalize assisted suicide. And that's just, culturally, we can see the difference between different regions of the U.S. Canada doesn't have such differences as the Americans do. We do have differences between provinces, that's true, but not to the same extent. I'm just saying that places in Canada that are more conservative are far more liberal than the conservative places in the U.S. So what the assisted suicide law has been doing is they've been trying to expand assisted suicide by obviously legalizing in more states. The last 2 years, they haven't, as I said, legalized in any new state, but they've certainly come close and very hard. So for instance, last year, there was a bill that passed in Nevada, but the Nevada governor he vetoed it. So therefore, they almost passed the law in Nevada, but the governor vetoed it. So that's a prime example of they have not been successful, but they have come close. And there's quite a few states in the U.S. where they have put a ton of money in. I mean, the assisted suicide lobby has put in millions of dollars in a few states to lobby them. Minnesota is a state they've been actually focusing on quite heavily. And I mentioned that because someone is from Minnesota, but they know it also. Where it's legal, they've been expanding the laws. So what have they been doing? They've been eliminating the waiting periods. So the original laws all had a 15-day waiting period. So if you look at the original Oregon law, it had a 15-day waiting period. And they wanted to expand assisted suicide by eliminating those waiting periods. Their goal is a same-day death. That's technically possible in Oregon. So in Oregon, they reduced the waiting period, but that waiting period can be waived if the doctor thinks the person is near to terminally ill. They can waive the waiting period. They also try to expand this by adding non-doctors to the list of who can do assisted suicide. So one of the problems with assisted suicide has been for the other side that they don't have enough doctors willing to do it. So now they've added physician assistants, nurses, nurse practitioners, and in some states there's been chiropractors, things like that. They've been looking at other groups of people who can then do the assisted suicide deaths. That expands it. They're also eliminating the residency requirements. So for instance, Oregon has eliminated the residency requirement. And last year you had, I believe, 23 people who died by assisted suicide in Oregon who were out of state residents. So they had a one-way trip to Oregon. And they're also trying to do this by euthanasia. So they've realized that assisted suicide has limits to it, whereas euthanasia is easier to do because the doctor actually carries out the death. I'm going to get into that for a second. They've been launching court cases to claim that there's a right to assisted suicide. So we've seen quite a few states where they had a court case claiming there was a right to assisted suicide. All of those cases have lost, but they've tried over and over again. Their goal was to get a decision that could go to the Supreme Court in the U.S. and lead to a decision someday, such as Glucksberg. They want to overturn the Glucksberg decision from '97, which said that there was no right to assisted suicide in the U.S. They want to permit assisted suicide by telehealth. Several states have done that already. I know in Oregon, you can get approved by assisted suicide by telehealth, even if it's not on the law. We know what's happening. They added that in the law in Hawaii and in Vermont, assisted suicide by telehealth. The reason for that is to make it easier for people to get approved for assisted suicide. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. In Hawaii, there's a couple of the islands that have never had an assisted suicide, even though it's legal in Hawaii. And the reason is there is no doctor in that island willing to do it. If you've got no doctor willing to do it, obviously speaking, you'll have no assisted suicide. So by approving it by telehealth, that means the person doesn't have to meet the doctor. They just have to talk to them in the same way as we're talking right now. They're trying to change the definition to allow assisted suicide for chronic conditions. You've actually seen that in Oregon. In Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority has changed how they interpret the meaning of the law. So therefore, you don't actually have to be terminally ill. You have to have a terminal condition. And they're trying to establish these regional assisted suicide centers and get rid of the residency requirements. So for instance, Oregon, you have the one doctor, Dr. Gideon, who is doing assisted suicides for out-of-state residents, and he's set up a type of a clinic. So the 2022 California Assisted Suicide Report, I'm going to go through this only because of how clear the report is as to who dies by assisted suicide. So you had California had 853 reported assisted suicide deaths in 2022. I'm saying that because all of these reports are always understatements. There's always a few more than they have in the report. Okay, that was a 63% increase from the year before. And it said that the ingestion status was unknown in 294 deaths. So you have to understand there's 853 reported assisted suicide deaths. There was 1,270 lethal prescriptions written, so lethal poison prescriptions written. And then it says 294 deaths where the ingestion status was unknown. So what this means is in 294 cases, so that's, if you do the math between the difference between 1,270 and 853, 294 of those cases that are not, they were people who had received the lethal poison. They were approved and received it. They know they died, but they have no idea how they died. Now, some of them will show up in the 2023 report. Nonetheless, that shows you this large number where they just don't know how they died. But if you look at the data, in California, 39% of the people who live in California are Hispanic, according to the latest census. 35% are white, 15% are Asian, but 89% of those who died were white. 6.3% were Asian, 2.8% were Hispanic. So who's dying by assisted suicide? It's the white, it's the worried, and it's the wealthy. Those are the people dying by assisted suicide. The death lobby tells you there's no slippery slope. But California currently has Bill SB 1196 that's designed to expand assisted suicide into euthanasia. So what the bill will allow, so first of all, what's the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide? Canada has euthanasia. Euthanasia is done by the doctor or the nurse practitioner. They do the act. So it is so in Canada, how we legalized it is we created an exception in our criminal code to homicide. So the doctor does the act. With assisted suicide, the doctor writes the lethal prescription. The person receives the lethal prescription, but they have to take it themselves technically. Now, the California amendment that they're trying to pass, which is SB 1196, that's in the California Senate right now, it would change it from having to self-ingest to allowing it to be done by intravenous. So that's euthanasia, what it would allow for euthanasia. They say that the person would have to do it themselves, but obviously speaking, it becomes indistinguishable from euthanasia. They want to remove the 6-month prognosis and replace it with the Canadian definition, which is grievous and irremediable medical condition. Well, there's a lot of us who have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. A lot of us do. And that doesn't mean we're terminally ill. It doesn't mean we're dying, but that means in California and in Canada right now, you could be approved to be killed. They want to allow people with early stage dementia. So they've defined early stage dementia as being a grievous and irremediable medical condition. So they would allow people with early stage dementia. Now, problem with early stage dementia is they haven't defined it in the legislation. So obviously speaking, what does it mean by early stage? What does it mean by mid stage? What does it mean by late stage dementia? What do you mean by this? If you don't define it, if there's no outline for it, then obviously the doctor will do what the doctor does. And they, of course, want to remove the residency requirement in the state of California to allow suicide tourists, or in this case, homicide tourists to California. So you see, California is moving to this wider expansion. So Oregon data. Now, this is more interesting for the Jackson County people, but anybody else from Oregon. The 2023 Oregon report indicated that there were 367 reported assisted suicide deaths, which was up by 21% from 304 in 2022. I'm going to get into the data in a minute because, the data is actually not accurate, and I'll show you in a second. And also, there was also in 2023, 566 lethal poison prescriptions written, which was up by 29% from 433 in 2022. Now, similar to California, there was 141 people in 2023 who received the lethal poison and who died, but their ingestion status was unknown. So once again, some of those people might have died by assisted suicide. We don't know. We have no idea. No one can tell you if they died by assisted suicide or not, because they don't know how they died. That should really make you feel good if you think about it. Like that, this is how we kill people, but we have no idea how these people died. We just know they received a lethal poison, and no report at this point was received at the point of the 2023 report coming out. And there was 23 assisted suicide deaths from out-of-state people. Now, the report said something else which is very interesting. It said that there could be more out-of-state residents who died by assisted suicide, but it said if they died in their own state, meaning they had received the lethal drugs in Oregon, but then maybe they went back to Minnesota and died by assisted suicide in Minnesota, I mean they self-ingested in Minnesota, then Oregon would not have that data. They would have no information about it. So there could be more. They don't know. The 2023 assisted suicide report is interesting because it updated the 2022 data. The reports every year, they update the previous year's data in the reports because there's always a certain percentage that come in late reporting. So your law requires that the reports to be sent in within 30 days. So when the report is published by the Oregon Department of Health in the end of March, you would think that all the reports have been received, but that's not the case. So the 2023 report claimed that there was 304 assisted suicide deaths in 2022 in Oregon, but the 2022 report said that there had been 278. So between the publishing of the 2022 report and the publishing of the 2023 report, they received 26 more reports of assisted suicide from the previous year. So these were late reports that came in. Now, what's important about that is some of those deaths the previous year were under that category of ingestion status was unknown, meaning they had died by assisted suicide, but no report had come in. But let's not be innocent about this. Every year, if you look at the number of those ingestion status unknown reports, numbers, you have to admit that every year there's probably a certain percentage of deaths that are never reported. The doctor never sent in the report. It just never happened. They died by assisted suicide, but no report was ever submitted. They just don't have that data because no one follows up on it. So I'm predicting actually there was probably 400 assisted suicide deaths, give or take a few, that actually happened in 2023 because the 2024 report will correct the 2023 report. You understand? You follow what I'm saying? They always underreport. So here's the other thing about Oregon, which is very important. We say, oh, there's only 10 known complications in 2023. 10 known complications. But if you look at the data, those 10 complications were based on 102 deaths because the report only has the data when the physician was present at the death. So of the 367 known assisted suicide deaths, the physician was only present in 102 of them. So therefore, they only know of 10 complications. People going into convulsions, throwing up, this kind of stuff, right? That's about 10%. So when you're looking at it, people think, oh, there's not a lot of complications. There's 367 deaths, 10 complications. What is that? That's about 3% at the worst, right? Actually, it's 10% because it's only based on 102. So if they actually had the data from all the deaths, it's very likely there was approximately 40 complications. And it's a very important thing to show. Like, the data is very clear. You have to break it down. In fact, in 2022, there was 7 known complications, but it was only based on 76 deaths. So the doctor was only present in 76 deaths. So you're starting to understand the data is really not telling us everything. Okay. In Oregon and even California and the rest of them. So the Gideon versus Brown case was the case that led to the removal of the residency requirement in Oregon. So instead of the state of Oregon, actually, they were challenged in court. The argument was that the residency requirement in the assisted suicide law was discriminatory because it was you couldn't base healthcare on residency. And in fact, if it were healthcare, they'd be correct. But assisted suicide is not healthcare. There's nothing actually about healthcare when we're talking about assisted suicide. Nonetheless, since they defined it as healthcare, that's how they looked at it. Since then, you also have had Vermont remove its residency requirement. So Compassionate Choice also launched a court case in Vermont. They removed their residency requirement. And now there's a court case in New Jersey trying to remove their residency requirement. The difference is in New Jersey, the state is actually trying to defend their assisted suicide laws. So they haven't actually removed their residency requirement. There was a bill in Colorado which was to remove the residency requirement in Colorado, but now they've removed that from the bill. And as I already pointed out, the California bill projects to remove the residency requirement if it's passed. Okay, I gotta go back here. Now, why is this important, the residency requirement? Well, first of all, anybody now in the US can die by assisted suicide in Oregon. Should make you guys in Oregon feel funny about that, people coming for a one-way trip to Oregon. The fact of, and I shouldn't joke about it, but it is the reality, isn't it? And then with this big push about assisted suicide by telehealth, which is a big push by the assisted suicide lobby, what they want to do is they want to have people approved for assisted suicide by telemedicine, by telehealth, like a Zoom meeting like we're having right now. They would approve them, and then all they'd have to do is fly to Oregon to die by assisted suicide because they would have already been approved for assisted suicide. And as I said, Oregon has a death center that is operated by Dr. Gideon. March 2022. Now, this shows you the changing of definitions that are going around. So, for instance, there's 2 ways of changing a law. One way is actually by changing it. So when you remove the residency requirement or you get rid of the 15-day waiting period and things like that, that's obviously going to expand the law. It's changing the law. The other way is by changing the interpretation of the law. What does it mean? So I'm going to give you a quick comment. In the Netherlands, it's true. The Netherlands legalized euthanasia in 2001. That law came into place in January of 2022. It has actually never been changed. The law has never been amended. So people will say to you, oh, well, Oregon made a few changes, but, there is no slippery slope with euthanasia or assisted suicide. But actually in the Netherlands, they've massively changed their law because they've reinterpreted the language of the law. The meaning of terminal illness has been changed. All these things have changed in the Netherlands. And I know that's not the Western US, but you know what I'm getting to. It's the same thing here. So Dr. Jennifer Guardiani, and she's an assisted suicide doctor. She had approved 3 assisted suicides for people with anorexia. And it was an article in the Colorado Sun in March of 2022. So what she was doing is she was redefining anorexia nervosa, and she was calling it which is normally considered a chronic condition, she was calling it a terminal condition. By defining it as terminal, she was doing assisted suicide of people with anorexia. Now, just so you know, in Oregon, in the 2021 report, it does list anorexia as a reason for assisted suicide. So it did not say that in 2022 or 2023, but certainly 2021 it did. Okay. Now, the other thing is this whole thing about how they kill people by assisted suicide. I fully realize how it works, but in around 2015, the assisted suicide lobby decided they need a cheaper, effective way to kill. So what they did is a bunch of these doctors got together, and they discussed new types of drug mixtures they could use in order to cause death. And so the Seattle Times reported in March of 2017 that the second alternative was too harsh. So what it did is it burned patients' mouths and throats, and it caused some of them to scream in pain. The second drug mix that they used led to these long drawn-out deaths. One was up to 31 hours. In fact, as you know, the longest assisted suicide death actually changed. It used to be 104 hours in Oregon, and that was a couple years ago. But last year in Oregon, they died. It took 5.5 days for them to die by assisted suicide in Oregon. That was one case. So you can see how the drug mixtures have affected the timing of one's death, but also the pain. I'll say something else to you. The senator in California who's promoting that assisted suicide should be done by IV, intravenous, she's saying that the reason for that is that these drugs cause pain and suffering for the patient. And she's actually absolutely correct. It's not what you call a death with dignity at all. It is a painful death. It might go reasonably quick in some cases, but very often it takes a very long time. I could talk to you longer about how it's done, but it doesn't excite me too much. In January 2019, The Atlantic published an article where they interviewed Dr. Robert Wood, who was the physician for End of Life Washington State. I don't know why they need a medical director of an assisted suicide group. I don't understand. Like, the whole thing's about killing people. I don't know why you need a medical director for that, but nonetheless, he said to the Atlantic, he said, they used chloral hydrate. He says, we know this is going to put you to sleep, and we're pretty sure it's going to kill you. So obviously that made people feel really comfortable, obviously. Then he says, it worked, but with the tragic catch, in a few cases, the chloral hydrate burned people's throats, causing severe pain just at the time they expected relief. So obviously the concept of a death with dignity by these drugs is a lie, right? The Medical Express reported on September 8th, 2020, a little-known secret not publicized by advocates of aid and dying was that while most deaths were speedy, others were very slow. Some patients lived more than 3 days. In fact, as I said, last year in Oregon, one of the deaths was 5.5 days. Assisted suicide is clearly not what it appears to be. Okay. Many people support assisted suicide for what reason? Based on fear of dying a bad death. A lot of them would say, I'm afraid of a bad death. And therefore, they're supporting assisted suicide because they think that will give them a death that is painless and easy and the rest of it. But in fact, it's not true. Many of these deaths are very painful, and many of them linger for a very, very long time. The AMA remains opposed to assisted suicide, so that's a great thing that's going on. I could talk about Canada for a second, but I don't think actually I need to in this case. What I'm going to say to you is we go back to the beginning slide where we talk about what are they doing. So Oregon was the first state to remove the residency requirement. What they did is in 2019, they passed a bill which reduced the residency requirement to 48 hours. And then they allowed the doctor to wait. No, sorry, it was 96 hours, but they allowed the doctor to waive. Sorry, the waiting period. The waiting period was 96 hours, but they allowed the doctor to waive the waiting period if they thought the person was near to death. I'm going to tell you a very quick story here. It's a Canadian story, though, but it really hits home with this whole thing about same-day deaths and everything. There was a case in Winnipeg, and it was at a Catholic hospital where someone was asking for euthanasia. And of course, the Catholic hospital refused to do it. But they did agree that if this person wants euthanasia, they can be transferred. So what they did is they were transferring this person to another hospital, a non-Catholic hospital, that is, obviously. And in that transfer process, the person died a natural death. And then what happened is the assisted suicide euthanasia lobby, they then sent in this article to the Winnipeg newspaper complaining that this person was denied their right to die. The person was so close to death, they didn't need to be killed by lethal drugs. They died a natural death as they were being transferred. But if you think about the concept, that's what the article in the newspaper was about. The person was right now. Well, they died. Okay. Canada's actually gone crazy with this. whole euthanasia thing. I'll tell you right off the bat, the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide is, first of all, the doctor is always present because the doctor is doing the act, right? The doctor is doing the act. Secondly, you don't get, and I'm not saying there's anything good about assisted suicide or anything good about euthanasia, because both are about killing. They're both identical in that sense. They use similar drugs. So the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide is not about what drugs are used. It's not about the intention. The intention is to cause death. It is about the fact that in euthanasia, the doctor does the act. And with assisted suicide, the doctor prescribes the lethal poison. You have to take it yourself. So obviously speaking, with euthanasia, if somebody is lingering, what they do in Canada is they give them a second dose. So if assisted suicide, you can't give them a second dose because it's defined as self-ingesting, right? Because it's been defined as self-ingesting, the person doesn't get a second dose. In Canada, if they're lingering, the doctor gives them a second shot. They're dead then, right? I'm not saying there's anything good about it, because there's not. It's all about killing, but you can see the difference about what happens between the two. That's also why that California senator's pushing it. She wants it by intravenous, because that's the same as euthanasia. Quebec has the highest euthanasia rate now in the world. I'm not going to get into all this, but what we have now in Canada is we have a situation where we've had people with disabilities who are living in poverty, homelessness, having an inability to receive medical treatment, all being killed by euthanasia. And since this is an American presentation, I'm just going to jump past it. So, for those who are out of Oregon or even in Oregon, I think that we have to be very clear about this, and we have to be willing to talk about it, but also we have to call it what it is. I think the fact that the other side has redefined the language hasn't helped us one bit. And I even hear presentations by people who oppose assisted suicide. I was just on Thursday speaking in Michigan, and the woman who introduced me, there's a big dinner, there's like a couple hundred people there. When she introduced me, she explained, about assisted suicide, but she used all the language of the other side. And I'm getting up there sort of being funny, because I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to tell you guys don't use that language. And I was introduced by someone who used that language. So we have to be clear. This is not about an assisted death. This is not, this is not medical aid in dying. This is about, intentionally causing someone's death. I'm opposed to killing people. We can't be afraid of saying these things. These are the kind of things that actually puts the truth to the act. And I think that's very important. We oppose assisted suicide. Why? We're opposed to people killing other people. We're opposed to one doctor being directly involved with killing another person. And if you look at the law gives the doctor total anonymity. If you read the Oregon law, it gives the doctor total anonymity. So they're involved with causing your death. They're intentionally prescribing you a lethal poison, and they are totally free under the law to continue freely doing so, because they have approved this as a physician. And it's the only based on the good faith principle. So you realize it's possible, even if families were upset with them about a death, it's impossible to actually prosecute the doctor under the law. The law is designed to protect them. So I say here, creating exceptions to homicide and manslaughter, these are bad ideas. These are really bad ideas. Think about it. Do you feel comfortable that a doctor or a nurse might have the right in law to kill you, or to be involved with killing you? And the answer, of course, is no. We need to be clear about what it is. This is about killing a person. They say this is about my body, my choice, right? I don't know if you guys have heard that before, right? They say it's about my body, my choice, but this is a lie. I call this the big lie. I say this to people all the time. Assisted suicide, euthanasia, it's about the big lie. They repeat the lie over and over again. They say this is about compassionate deaths. This is about my freedom and my autonomy. And it's not about autonomy when somebody else is prescribing you lethal poisons, giving you lethal poisons, or putting it into your body via intravenous or lethal injection. This is not autonomy. You might have asked for it, that's correct, but it's not autonomy when someone's directly involved with killing you. That's a false autonomy. It doesn't define that way at all. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, assisted suicide is not an autonomous act because somebody else is directly involved in the act. Many of these people requesting assisted suicide also have issues of capacity, and they're not being sent for psychiatric assessments. They're just not. The doctor's just saying, I wouldn't want to live like you either. And most of these people are asking for this. Why? Based on hopelessness, despair, alienation, cognitive disorders. They're feeling alone, lonely. They feel their life lacks meaning, purpose, or value. Assisted suicide is about abandonment, not autonomy. Call it what it is. It's abandonment. We're culturally abandoning and medically abandoning these people. It's not even a medical act. Who's kidding who? Why do people ask for it? And I think this is the primary reason. So there are some radicals. Many of you have seen articles in a newspaper with these people demanding their right to die. They're celebrating their right to die. They're actually in the minority. There's not a lot of people actually like that. There are some, and they're loud, and you see them in the papers, etc. There's enough of them that they seem like, oh, there's a large number of them, but the majority actually aren't like that. Most people die by assisted suicide or ask for assisted suicide because they're going through a difficult health condition. Absolutely, no question about it. They're feeling depressed, lonely. They're experiencing feelings of hopelessness. They believe their life has lost meaning, purpose, or value. These are deaths of despair. That's what they are, deaths of despair. This is not about freedom. This is clearly about abandonment. Assisted suicide threatens my life because I'm human. It threatens your life because you're human. It's normal when I'm or you are going through a difficult time in your life that you might question your purpose for living. You might wonder, you might have existential distress. You might fear for your future. You might experience situational depression. All these things, you might lose hope. Many people lose hope. If you visit someone in the hospital and they're talking in a very down way, it's not because they're a terrible person. It's because they're a human being going through a lot of distress and they've lost hope. The problem with legalizing assisted suicide is when someone expresses their feeling that they'd rather be dead, when they express that they've lost hope, then you can kill them. The doctor can approve their death. Suffering alone is also another big problem in our culture. We know that. A lot of people are suffering alone, living with loneliness, isolation, and depression. This is a serious problem. And I have to go back here to get it moving again. The culture of abandonment associated with assisted suicide, we could change that by creating a caring culture. So for instance, in Canada, we've set up something called compassionate community care. I think I'm getting into that in the next slide. But it's essential that people who feel that their life lacks meaning, purpose, or value have somebody in their life who assures them of their meaning, who provides them genuine hope. You know, years ago, before you legalized assisted suicide, and maybe not that many years ago, certainly in Canada, I used to go to quite a few palliative care presentations, and you'd hear these nurses talking about someone who's nearing death. And the question was always, well, what about someone who's lost hope? Like, there's so many difficult conditions. And they would always say the same thing, because these well-trained, caring nurses who didn't kill people, they would say, the goal is to help them find a little purpose, a little meaning, little hopes. You know, talk about their grandchild, talk about their son, talk about things that make them happy. You find a little hopes, a little meanings. Say, oh, you know, so-and-so, so they're going to come visit you tomorrow. These are the kind of things. And it's no different here. The difference is that when someone loses hope and they've asked to have their life ended and it's legal, guess what? It becomes their death sentence. And that's exactly what's going on. So we're told that the people are asking for this based on physical pain. If you look at the data out of Oregon, you see that that is the minority. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. You and I know it does happen. But these are the minority of the cases. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about those people. I'm saying, yes, we should be concerned about them, but they're not the majority. Most people are not asking for this based on pain and suffering. Most people are not radical autonomous. Most people are experiencing physical or psychological distress, and they're feeling depressed and lonely. They're feeling like they've lost hope or meaning. This is why they're asking for this, okay? So in Canada, I say we established a compassionate community care charity. We're willing to work with you. And what we're doing is we're training people to do visiting. We recognize that in our own communities, people are dying by euthanasia. People in our church communities, people in our local communities around us, people we know. Everyone's now got stories of that person who died by euthanasia. And the answer is, well, is there something I could have done? Sometimes there is. Sometimes I knew them and I should have visited them. Or sometimes we need to have that, especially in our church communities. You know, it wasn't that long ago. I'm not saying your church is having this problem. I don't know. But it wasn't that long ago when it was a normal part of a church community that there was a fairly large group of visitors. They visited people. They spent time with people. The community was interconnected. Human beings are interconnected. That's how we are. That's how we thrive, right? That's when we lose that interconnection, when we're lonely and we're abandoned in our culture. That's when euthanasia and assisted suicide thrives. And I'm seeing it in my country in spades. and you see it in many places throughout the US. So what is CCC doing? Is providing also advocacy training and visitor training. We also have a 1-800 number. So we're receiving calls from people and providing help for them. And there's my information. So why are things happening in the West? Things start in the West, things are being promoted in the West. I think that in the West, as I say, you have a different culture than throughout other parts of the US. There seems to be a bit of an attitude, I can do my own thing and don't bother me. There's also less of a religiosity in the West for some reason in the US. You can see that in the polling numbers. You guys vote Democrat. I'm not going to hold it against you, but it seems to be a reality. If, if you can change that a bit, maybe you'll do a bit better. Nonetheless, the fact of it is we need to replace the culture of death with the culture of caring. And that's not an easy task. Changing culture is not a short-term thing. Remember, we didn't get here slowly. We didn't get here quickly either. It took a long time. You legalized assisted suicide in the 90s. It took a long time before Washington State then legalized, right? It took a long time. Everywhere they assisted suicide lobby tried, they failed. Then they got Washington State, and then it took them a long time. Once they got rolling, though, it seems to have a bit of growth in it. But even then, we have, like, in the last 2 years, it hasn't been legalized anywhere. Think of the number of states assisted suicide defeated in the legislatures in the last few years. It's actually quite amazing. It's quite impressive. I can tell you about, like, Connecticut, for instance. Connecticut's a very liberal Democrat state, very extreme. If you look at the composition of their elected representatives, you'd say, oh gosh, holy moly. And yet they've been defeating assisted suicide all the time. So it's very interesting how it's done. But I do realize that we need to create a culture of caring where we have a culture of death. Now, I don't know if there's any time for questions. I'm looking at my clock. I did use up at least 35 minutes or 37 minutes. So it's a fair amount of time. If someone at Jackson County wants to give me input as to what you think, we could maybe take a couple questions if you want to. I'm looking at the chat right now. The other thing is the other side has an easier story than us. Now, why? Well, the other side gives us these sad stories of people who are suffering, and those stories do exist. And yes, there are some people who are suffering greatly. And as a human being, we should be bothered by that. But we don't kill people because they're going through a difficult time of their life. We're supposed to care for them. The problem with killing is it affects all of us. The comment from Michael in Minnesota was, I'm cautiously optimistic that assisted suicide bill here is dead for this year. It appears that it might be dead, Michael, for this year. Sadly, it's back next year for sure. Hopefully the election helps you out a bit. Hopefully. We can always hope that, right? One question is about, gaining traction in the West. Yeah. We also have a lot going on in Europe, so it's interesting. We've got, Eva's joined us from Europe, Kansas, I probably know. We talk a lot about the vulnerable, and when you look at the data in the U.S., it tends to be, as I say, the white, worried, and the wealthy who are dying by assisted suicide. Well, there also tend to be more educated, etc. But the fact of it is that if you look at Canada, we've seen a shift. So once we took out the terminal illness requirement out of the law, that meant that people with disabilities were immediately then able to be approved because you needed to have an irremediable medical condition, which is what California is talking about now. Well, medical condition is clearly defined then as something of somebody having a disability, right, would qualify. So what's happened is we've had a lot of people who have disabilities, who are living in poverty, who have been experiencing homelessness, experiencing difficulties with medical treatment questions, who have been dying by euthanasia. So obviously, when we look at these things, once again, the language of a law is everything. Cynthia, you have a question?
Yes, hi, Alex. Sorry. I just wanted to ask about the term homicide that I had seen in some of your writing. I don't know if it was something/homicide as a term used. Is that just kind of a literary term at this point? It's not really used in in any political sense. Like
But
it's
the
not.
reason I use the term homicide is because that's what we use
Yeah.
in the law, right?
Yes. Okay.
So
Yes.
I don't know about Oregon, but in the Canada, if you look at the legal terms, they talk about homicide, whereas really we're talking about murder, right? That's what we're talking about.
Yes. Yes.
So we
Exactly.
legalized an exception to homicide in the criminal code, is what we did
Yes.
in Canada.
Yes.
So,
Very good. I thought it was coming from that side, and but it's good. It's good because that's the word that it is. So that's how it should be.
yeah, and
Yeah.
Bill has his hand up. Can you unmute yourself, and then it will be definitely time.
Sure. I have a quick question. In North Carolina, we have the Democrats always file an end of options act, and it's never
Yep.
gotten through committee. So what they did this past session was they said, "Oh, well, let's do a study." The North Carolina Institute of Medicine, let's do a study on
Right.
medical aid and dying, and they appropriated $150,000. Well, I've been able to block that from getting through committee in the legislature so
Good.
far. But we're
Good.
getting ready to start our short session, and it could come up again. My
Yeah, you
question is, if they did approve money for that, is there any way that, or any group that I could say, well, look, you gave them money. Well, let me get the other side of the question, and let's appropriate $150,000 to have somebody else other than the North Carolina Institute of Medicine look at the question.
Now, first of all, the North Carolina Institute of Medicine does not sound like the physicians. Is this a group that's more specifically pro-assisted suicide then?
Yes, I think it's very liberal.
Okay. Well, the fact of it is you want to plug, you don't want anybody to get money like that. Like, why would we be throwing, because if you're going to do a study, for the purpose for the study is to kill. Okay. So if
Right.
you're not going to have a study unless you actually want to legalize. So there's no need for the study. Now, who is on the other side? Well, obviously they wanted to give money to a North Carolina institute. You might have something similar in North Carolina, but that would be opposed. And I'm not exactly sure who that would be at the moment, but you would want it to be a local thing, or some researcher. But the fact of it is I don't think we'd even want to go there, because then you're going to get some competing reports thing. And I don't know how helpful that is. I know that Nick Gorin in Australia wrote a fabulous report opposing euthanasia, assisted suicide. But in the end, they still went ahead and legalized. So a National Council on Disabilities had a study. That's correct too, Michael. That's absolutely correct. They had a study that they put out. I would say no one should be getting money for such a thing. Anyway, I'm going to thank everybody. We're going to stop our share here, and I'm going to thank them for joining us. Remember, this event came on specifically because I did a talk in Oregon, and then the people in Jackson County said, well, please do one for us. And I said, absolutely, I can. So Nick actually put in the chat a link to the document that he wrote, which was fabulous. And he did that in Australia. And as much as it was a fabulous document, they still went ahead and legalized anyway. I'm not saying, the fact of it is you don't want them to do a study anyway. We just don't want that. And so this presentation was for the Jackson County group. And I've invited all of you because it just makes sense if I'm going to be presenting to them. Might as well have people join us for the fun. Thank you very much.